The night sky over the Pacific was deceptively calm. The waves shimmered under moonlight, but what rose from the horizon left Japanese scouts stunned. One after another, massive silhouettes emerged, towering decks bristling with aircraft, lit faintly by work crews preparing for the dawn launch. These were not isolated flagships, nor the fragile carriers Japan had gambled everything upon. They were floating airfields, dozens of them rolling off American shipyards with a speed that defied belief. Only months earlier, Japanese commanders had celebrated their victory lists. Lexington, Yorktown, Hornet American carriers battered some loss to torpedoes and bombs. Yet as they toasted across the ocean, U.S. shipyards were already hammering steel, laying keels and welding sections together in an industrial rhythm, more relentless than the tides themselves. When one carrier fell, two more seemed to rise in its place. By mid-1944, those efforts erupted onto the battlefield. Task Force 58 steamed forward with a sky-crushing arsenal, hundreds of Hellcats Avengers and dauntless dive bombers waiting to launch in coordinated waves. Radar operators traced the incoming Japanese strike groups, pilots sprinted to their cockpits, and an armada of Essex-class carriers unleashed a storm that would later be remembered with a mocking nickname, the Great Marianas Turkey. Shoot! To Japanese aviators, the scale was incomprehensible. They launched with pride only to face swarms of American fighters and walls of flak. To U.S. crews, the message was clear. Their nation's factories and shipyards had turned time into a weapon. America was building carriers faster than Japan could sink them. And every new Essex sliding down the ways wasn't just steel and rivets. It was another floating runway of destruction, promising that from this point forward, the Pacific would belong to the United States Navy. When the war in the Pacific erupted in 1941, the balance of naval power appeared uncertain. Japan had stunned the world with its lightning strike on Pearl Harbor, crippling the American battleship line, and demonstrating that the age of the aircraft carrier had truly arrived. In the months that followed, the Imperial Japanese Navy wielded its carriers like a rapier, striking at the Coral Sea Midway and across the Indian Ocean. American forces fought back bravely, but every clash exacted a brutal toll. The U.S. Navy lost 4 frontline carriers, Lexington, Yorktown, Wasp and Hornet, between May and October of 1942. To many observers, it looked as though Japan might dominate the seas indefinitely. Yet what Japanese planners failed to fully appreciate was the industrial engine humming behind the American war effort. Even as sailors struggled to hold Guadalcanal, even as marine pilots fought desperately over Henderson Field, a different battle was raging in the shipyards of the Atlantic coast. There, Congress had already authorized the Two-Ocean Navy Act of 1940, laying the foundation for a fleet unprecedented in scale. At the heart of that expansion was a new class of carrier designed not as experimental marvels or one-off flagships, but as the standardized backbone of a global war fleet, the Essex-class. The Essex design struck a balance between size, speed, and producibility. Displacing around 27000 tons standard and closer to 36000 at full load, each ship was large enough to carry a powerful air group, but not so massive that construction would drag on for years. The hulls could be assembled at multiple shipyards simultaneously with shared blueprints and interchangeable parts. Innovations such as moving the aircraft elevators to the deck edge improved flight operations and freed up hangar space. Armor protection and damage control systems were emphasized after the lessons of early war carrier losses. These were not fragile queens of the sea. They were war horses meant to endure punishment and keep fighting. Equally important was the production philosophy. Unlike Japan, which concentrated its resources on a handful of highly advanced carriers, America aimed for scale. The Essex blueprints could be handed to Newport News, to Fall River, to the Brooklyn Navy Yard, to Philadelphia, and to Norfolk. Steel from the Midwest turbines from General Electric and aircraft from Grumman and Curtiss all flowed into these yards in a coordinated torrent. America's industrial might turned the building of a 300,000-ton warship into something approaching an assembly line. By 1943, the results were tangible. New Essex carriers were sliding down the ways at a rate that stunned foreign observers. Where pre-war naval architects had estimated a carrier might require 3 to 4 years from keel to commission, American yards were turning them out in as little as 15 to 20 months. USS Lexington CV-16 was laid down in July. 1941, launched in September 1942, and commissioned by February 1943, barely a year and a half from start to finish. USS Ticonderoga CV-14 took only 15 months from keel laying to active service. This pace was unprecedented, and it meant that even as Japan claimed victories at sea, the replacements were already preparing to sail. While the Essex carriers grabbed the headlines, a parallel miracle was unfolding with the escort carriers. At Kaiser's Vancouver Yard on the west coast, the Casablanca-class was produced almost like Liberty ships with prefabricated sections welded together at staggering speed. At the peak, nearly one escort carrier per week was launched 50 in less than 2 years. These ships were not meant to duel with Japanese fleet carriers. Instead, they freed the Essexes from convoy duty, trained new pilots, and brought close air support to amphibious invasions. Together, the Essex and Casablanca classes formed a layered system that no enemy could hope to match. Meanwhile, on the tactical and doctrinal side, the Navy's carrier commanders were adapting quickly. Gone were the days when American carriers operated singly or in pairs. By 1943, Admiral Mark Mitcher and others forged the concept of the Fast Carrier Task Force, a striking arm composed of multiple Essex-class carriers sailing together, screened by cruisers and destroyers, and supplied by an NDOPES, ever-expanding train of oilers and support vessels. This concentration of power ensured that when the U.S. struck with overwhelming force. A single task force might deploy 700 to 900 aircraft coordinating radar-guided interceptions, massed dive-bombing raids, and relentless torpedo runs. On the Japanese side, the picture was far grimmer. While America's yards were launching new hulls in record time, Japan struggled even to maintain its existing fleet. The Taihō, hailed as a next-generation armored carrier, was sunk by a single submarine torpedo in June 1944, the resulting explosion magnified by poor damage control. The giant Shinano, converted from a Yamato-class battleship hull, lasted only 10 days after commissioning before another American submarine sent it to the bottom. The Unryu, class intended as Japan's answer to the Essex, saw only 3 ships completed, and even those were hobbled by shortages of trained pilots and aviation fuel. Japan could not match America's shipbuilding pace, and worse, it could not replace the human skill being lost in battle after battle. By mid-1944, the contrast had become impossible to ignore. America had placed more than a dozen Essex carriers into service, with many more fitting out. Each one was bristling with fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes, and each one was integrated into a doctrine of massed carrier warfare that maximized their impact. Radar-equipped fighters could intercept attackers long before they reached the fleet. Proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells filled the skies with lethal fragments, and damage control teams drilled relentlessly could contain fires and flooding that would have doomed earlier carriers. The psychological impact was enormous. Japanese pilots, once accustomed to meeting U.S. forces on near-equal terms, now faced waves of Hellcats that outnumbered and outperformed their planes. Commanders who plotted bold strikes in 1942 now found themselves cornered, their carriers sunk, in days their pilots consumed in what survivors bitterly called suicide missions. To the Americans, each victory reinforced the sense that their nation's factories were fighting alongside them, delivering not only replacement ships but entire new fleets. Thus, by the eve of the Marianas campaign, the stage was set. The Essex carriers had moved from blueprints to reality, from keels on the slips to floating airfields dominating the horizon. The men who served aboard them felt an unshakable confidence behind them, stood an industrial arsenal that no torpedo, no bomb, and no kamikaze could outpace. Japan might launch daring attacks, but the Essex-class ensured that the United States could answer with overwhelming force again and again until final victory. The Essex carriers were more than ships, they were the living embodiment of America's ability to turn factories, shipyards, and assembly lines into weapons of war. To truly understand their impact, one must step inside the shipyards of the early 1942. The atmosphere was a strange mix of clanging steel, roaring welders, and relentless schedules dictated not by calendars but by stopwatches. These were not the centuries-old docks of Europe crafting vessels through artisanal tradition. They were industrial complexes where warships weighing 3,000,000 tons were assembled like machines, each section prefabricated and riveted together with astonishing speed. In Newport News, Virginia, workers labored around the clock in shifts, pouring steel plates and shaping massive hull sections. At the Brooklyn Navy Yard, thousands of skilled laborers, many of them immigrants or the sons of immigrants, swarmed over skeletons of carriers, welding bulkheads and installing machinery. Philadelphia, Fall River in Quincy and Norfolk all added their rhythms to this great symphony of production. Each yard followed the same standardized blueprints. A turret here, a boiler there, the same across every ship. It was this uniformity that allowed the Essex to be replicated so quickly. The philosophy was simple: build ships that could be produced in series, maintained with interchangeable parts, and operated by crews trained to move seamlessly from one vessel to another. If a new Essex joined the fleet, its officers and men already knew exactly where to find the radar room, the hangar lifts, the engine controls. The learning curve flattened and operational readiness soared. Timeframes that would have been considered impossible in peacetime became normal. USS Ticonderoga, for instance, was laid down in February 1943, launched barely 12 months later, and commissioned by May 1944, 15 months from blueprint to battle-ready giant. USS Lexington, begun in July 1941, was in the fleet by February 1943. USS Bunker Hill followed in just 20 months. These numbers are staggering when one considers the complexity of a fleet carrier with its thousands of compartments, miles of wiring, and delicate aviation equipment. Yet America achieved them not once but again and again across more than 24 hulls. Japan, meanwhile, struggled to complete even a handful of replacements. The Taihō, trumpeted as a new generation of armored carrier, took years to finish, only to be lost almost immediately to a submarine's torpedo. The Shinano, the largest carrier in the world, was commissioned in November 1944, but sank within 10 days, another victim of American submarines and poor damage control. Where America could build 15 to 20 carriers in the time Japan produced one, the imbalance was fatal. The Essex carriers were also marvels of adaptability. Their air groups evolved constantly as newer planes entered service. At first, a typical Essex carried about 90 aircraft, 36 fighters, 36 dive bombers and 18 torpedo bombers. But as the war intensified, configurations shifted to prioritize fighters. By 1944, many carried as many as 70 Hellcats, forming a shield against Japanese raids and ensuring air superiority wherever the fleet sailed. Each carrier became a mobile fortress, capable of projecting power hundreds of miles from its deck. Behind these ships stood another industrial miracle, the Casablanca-class escort carriers, built at Henry J. Kaiser's yard in Vancouver, Washington. They were smaller, slower, and lightly armed, but they were produced at a breathtaking pace. Nearly one escort carrier a week slid into the Columbia River at the height of production. Between 1,943 and 1,944.50 were completed in less than 2 years. These ships relieved the Essexes of convoy duty, trained thousands of pilots, and provided vital close air support during amphibious invasions. While the Essexes struck like hammers, the Casablancas worked as the anvil, ensuring no gap in America's maritime air power. The pace of production was so relentless that even battle losses were rendered meaningless. When the carrier USS Princeton, a smaller Independence class, was sunk in 1944, its absence barely registered in the larger fleet. By then, new Essexes were commissioning so quickly that the Navy could replace entire task groups within weeks. The Japanese, by contrast, found every loss catastrophic. A carrier lost was irreplaceable, its planes and crews gone forever. Equally vital was the logistical train that kept these carriers supplied. The Essexes were hungry beasts, consuming thousands of gallons of aviation, fueled tons of bombs, and endless spare parts for their aircraft. But here again America's industrial base came through. Fleet oilers, ammunition ships, and repair vessels extended the range of the fast carrier task forces indefinitely. By 1944, American carriers could steam across the Pacific, strike an enemy base, and be refueled at sea before the enemy even understood what had happened. This combination, rapid production, standardization, adaptable air groups, and a global logistics network, meant that every Essex was more than just a ship. It was the visible tip of a vast iceberg of American power. Every rivet, every steel plate, every gallon of fuel carried with it the weight of an economy that had turned itself into a war machine. To Japanese observers, it seemed surreal. A carrier sunk at Midway should have weakened the US Navy for years. Instead, by 1943, new Essex-class vessels were entering service in waves, their decks lined with Hellcats ready to dominate the skies. By the time of the Marianas campaign, the Imperial Japanese Navy was not just facing a fleet, it was facing an assembly line. By the spring of 1944, the Essex carriers were no longer just promising blueprints or isolated warships. They were the heart of a revolution in naval warfare. Out of them grew the mighty Fast Carrier Task Force, a formation so powerful that it became both sword and shield for the US Navy across the Pacific. The concept was simple but devastating. Instead of scattering carriers as had been done at Coral Sea and Midway, the Essexes would sail in concentrated groups, mutually supporting one another with layers of air patrols overlapping, anti-aircraft batteries, and the ability to launch hundreds of aircraft in a single coordinated strike. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding Task Force 58, orchestrated this symphony of steel and aviation. When his ships approached enemy waters, the horizon itself seemed to bristle with flight decks. 7 fleet carriers, mostly Essexes, might sail side by side, each with its own fighter, director, and air group commander, but all acting in unison. Around them, cruisers and destroyers formed protective screens, while fast battleships stood ready to throw their heavy guns against any surface threat. And stretching over the sea behind them was a supply train of oilers, ammunition, ships, and tenders, the lifeline that allowed this juggernaut to strike anywhere and keep striking. The first real test came with the Marshall's and Gilbert's campaigns, where the Essex carriers unleashed relentless air raids on Japanese bases. Tarawa, Kwajalein, and Eniwetok all fell under the rain of American bombs delivered from decks that had been bare steel only 18 months earlier. These victories proved the model worked. Massed carriers could neutralize enemy airfields, sink shipping, and pave the way for amphibious assaults with unprecedented speed. But the true demonstration of American power came during the invasion of the Marianas in June 1944. Operation Forager required nothing less than the annihilation of Japan's carrier fleet. The Imperial Navy responded by assembling its last great gamble, 9 carriers, with more than 400 planes backed by land-based aircraft from Guam, Tinian, and Saipan. On paper, it looked formidable. In reality, it was an act of desperation. Task Force 58 sailed into the Philippine Sea with a strength Japan could not fathom. 15 carriers, including 7 Essex-class, brought nearly 900 aircraft into the fight. For every Japanese Zero or Jill torpedo bomber, there were 2 American Hellcats waiting. The imbalance was not only in numbers but in quality. American pilots had been blooded in 2 years of relentless combat, trained under a system that produced thousands of aviators each year. Japanese air crews, by contrast, were shadows of the elite who had triumphed at Pearl Harbor. Losses at Midway, Guadalcanal, and the Solomons had consumed irreplaceable veterans. By 1944, many new Japanese pilots had fewer than 100 hours of flight time before being thrown into combat. On the 19th of June, Japanese scouts finally spotted the American fleet and launched wave after wave of strikes. What met them was something no Japanese aviator had ever faced before. Hellcats rose in disciplined formations guided by radar controllers who could track enemy squadrons long before they approached visual range. American anti-aircraft fire, enhanced by the revolutionary proximity fuse, filled the sky with lethal fragments. In the hours that followed, nearly 400 Japanese aircraft were destroyed, so many that US pilots derisively called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Yet the carnage did not end in the air. As the Japanese fleet tried to regroup, American submarines prowled the seas and struck hammer blows. USS Albacore torpedoed the Taihō, Japan's newest and most advanced carrier, causing an explosion that ripped her apart. USS Kavala sank Shokaku, a veteran of Pearl Harbor, in a storm of fire and oil. What was left of Japan's carrier fleet retreated in tatters, its air wings annihilated. The next day, Admiral Mitcher unleashed one of the most audacious carrier strikes of the war. With daylight fading and fuel running low, he ordered his pilots to attack the fleeing Japanese fleet at extreme range, nearly 300 miles from the carriers. Hundreds of planes roared off the decks, struck the enemy at dusk, and then faced the perilous task of finding their way back in the dark. Many ditched in the sea, running out of fuel, but the blow had been delivered. The carrier Taihō was sunk, and more Japanese aircraft were destroyed on the decks of fleeing ships. By the time the smoke cleared, Japan had lost 3 carriers, and between 550 and 645 aircraft. America had lost barely over 100 planes, most of them to the treacherous nighttime landings rather than enemy action. The Essex carriers had not only survived but emerged stronger, their crews hardened, their confidence unshakable. From this point forward, Japanese carrier power effectively ceased to exist. The Essex-class and their sisters roamed the seas unchallenged, pounding Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and finally the Japanese home islands themselves. For Japanese commanders, the sight of yet another brand-new American carrier appearing on the horizon was a psychological hammer blow. Every time they hoped attrition might slow the enemy, another Essex appeared fresh from the yards bristling with planes. The contrast with Japan's own efforts was devastating. The Unryu-class carriers intended to replace the shattered fleet trickled into service one by one, only to be sunk before they could make a difference. The giant Shinano pride of the Imperial Navy was sent to the bottom by a single submarine before she could even load her air group. In the cold arithmetic of war, Japan had lost not just the Battle of the Philippine Sea, but the carrier war entirely. The Essex carriers proved that wars were no longer decided solely by courage or tactics, but by the ability to mass-produce complex weapons faster than they could be destroyed. With every rivet driven in Brooklyn or Newport News, the fate of the Pacific tilted further in America's favor. The waters of the Philippine Sea shimmered under the harsh June sun of 1944. But beneath that calm surface raged one of the most decisive clashes in naval history. This was not merely a battle of ships or aircraft, it was a confrontation between 2 national strategies. Japan had gambled everything on a single crushing blow to halt America's advance. The United States, by contrast, wielded the weight of its factories and shipyards embodied in the Essex-class carriers that now filled the horizon. On the 19th of June, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched its grand offensive. Scouts located the American fleet, and commanders ordered nearly 400 planes into the air. To the Japanese aviators, many of whom were young and barely trained, the mission seemed straightforward: smash the American carriers, destroy their air groups, and save the Marianas. But what awaited them was a nightmare beyond anything they could have imagined. Radar screens aboard the American carriers lit up with approaching blips. Fighter directors calmly vectored Hellcat squadrons into position. Engines roared to life, and sleek F-6Fs vaulted into the sky, climbing to intercept. Within minutes, the 2 forces collided. The Hellcat proved superior in speed, armor, and firepower. Japanese formations broke apart, swarmed from all directions. American pilots, veterans of countless engagements, executed disciplined attacks while green Japanese crews faltered. Explosions dotted the sky as Zeros and Judys spiraled down in flames. For the sailors on deck, the scene resembled a storm of falling wreckage. Gun crews filled the skies with flak, their shells armed with proximity fuses that detonated near enemy planes, shredding wings and fuselages. Many attackers never even reached the fleet. Those that slipped through met layered defenses, destroyer screens, then cruisers, then the carrier's own bristling anti-aircraft batteries. When the smoke cleared from the first wave, more than 200 Japanese aircraft had been annihilated. Wave after wave followed, but the results remained the same. By dusk, Japan had lost so many aircraft that the pilots themselves dubbed the slaughter an aerial hell. To the Americans, it felt almost unreal, like a shooting gallery. One US pilot quipped it was the Great Marianas turkey shoot, and the nickname stuck. By the end of the day, nearly 400 Japanese aircraft lay destroyed, their remnants littering the ocean. Yet the hammer blows were not confined to the air. Beneath the waves, American submarines prowled like sharks. USS Albacore sighted the brand-new carrier Taihō and loosed a spread of torpedoes. One struck home. At first, damage seemed manageable, but poor ventilation and fuel vapors turned the ship into a floating bomb. Hours later, Taihō erupted in a cataclysmic explosion, taking over 1600 sailors with her. Meanwhile, USS Kavala stalked Shokaku, a veteran of Pearl Harbor, and delivered 3 fatal hits. Fire and smoke consumed the great carrier, which sank with nearly 1,300 men. In one day, 2 of Japan's finest carriers were gone. Still, Admiral Mitchell sought a decisive end. On the 20th of June, with the Japanese fleet retreating westward, he faced a brutal choice. His pilots had only a few hours of daylight left, and the enemy was nearly 300 miles away at the extreme limit of range. Launching meant risking their lives on a night return. Yet Mitchell, knowing the strategic stakes, gave the order, strike, repeat strike. Hundreds of planes roared off the decks of the Essex carrier's engines, straining under heavy loads of bombs and torpedoes. They found the Japanese fleet at dusk. Bombs crashed through decks, torpedoes ripped hulls, and the carrier Taihō exploded in flames before slipping beneath the waves. Other ships limped away, battered their decks, charred their aircraft, destroyed. Then came the most harrowing chapter. As night fell, American pilots turned back toward their carriers, many already low on fuel. Darkness cloaked the Pacific, leaving men to navigate by stars and instinct. One by one, engines sputtered dry, forcing crews to ditch into the sea. Waves swallowed planes whole as rescue destroyers scrambled to pick up survivors. On the flight decks, Admiral Mitchell made a daring decision. Against every protocol of wartime security, he ordered the carriers to switch on their lights, towering silhouettes glowing like beacons in the night. It was a risk, but it saved countless lives. Dozens of pilots found their way home, guided by the shining decks of their ships. When dawn broke, the results were staggering. Japan had lost 3 carriers, more than 550 aircraft, and most of its remaining veteran pilots. America had lost barely over 100 planes, many of them to the darkness rather than enemy fire. Not a single Essex had been sunk. The balance of power was shattered. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was more than a tactical victory. It was a strategic turning point. Japan's dream of halting the American advance in the Central Pacific had collapsed. Its carrier air arm, once the terror of Pearl Harbor, lay in ruins. Never again would the Imperial Navy mount a serious carrier offensive. The Essex carriers had proven invincible, their steel decks and endless aircraft fueled by an industrial machine Japan could never hope to rival. For the men aboard, the battle left memories etched forever. Pilots recalled the endless horizon of burning planes, the eerie glow of carriers lit in defiance of danger, and the grim knowledge that they had witnessed the death of Japan's naval air power. For the Japanese, it was shock and disbelief, a realization that their proud fleet had been annihilated in mere days. From that point on, the Pacific belonged to the Essex carriers. Their very presence became a symbol of American inevitability. The tide had turned, and nothing Japan could do would stop the storm rolling toward its home islands. The smoke from the Philippine Sea still lingered in the minds of survivors when the true meaning of the Essex carriers became clear. The battle had not only decimated Japan's naval air power, it had confirmed that America's shipyards could build floating airfields faster than the enemy could ever hope to destroy them. From that point onward, the Essex-class symbolized inevitability. Every time one slid down the ways at Newport News or Philadelphia, the fate of the Pacific tilted further against Japan. The immediate consequence was stark. Japan's carrier arm was finished. Without experienced pilots, without the ability to fuel or train replacements, the surviving Japanese carriers became little more than empty hulls. In contrast, American Essex carriers continued to multiply. By late 1944, more than a dozen sailed in unison, forming task groups that dominated entire theaters. When U.S. Marines landed on Saipan, Guam, and Tinian, waves of Hellcats and Avengers provided unbroken air cover. At Leyte Gulf, Essex carriers launched strikes that crippled Japanese battleships and carriers alike, ensuring the Philippines would return to Allied hands. Yet the impact went beyond tactical victories. The Essex carriers changed the very nature of naval warfare. For centuries, sea power had been measured in battleships, great-gunned leviathans slugging it out in line of battle. But by 1945, the Essex-class had proved that air power, not gun power, ruled the oceans. Their decks became runways from which wars could be decided hundreds of miles inland. Battleships, once symbols of national pride, were reduced to escorts and fire support, while the Essexes dictated the tempo of entire campaigns. The industrial lesson was just as powerful. Japan had invested enormous resources into a few spectacular ships, Taihō, Shinano, Unryu. But one by one they fell or never made it into battle, overwhelmed by shortages of materials, fuel, and trained crews. The United States, by contrast, focused on standardization and scale. Every Essex was nearly identical, meaning spare parts, crew training, and repair work were simplified. If one was damaged, it could be patched quickly because every system had a twin elsewhere in the fleet. In war, this efficiency was worth more than any technical marvel. Consider USS Franklin struck by bombs off Japan in March 1945. Fires tore through her hangar, explosions ripped her decks apart, and more than 700 sailors were killed. Yet she did not sink. Damage control crews fought hour after hour saving the ship. Franklin limped back to Pearl Harbor and eventually to New York, proof that the Essex design could endure punishment that would have doomed carriers of other navies. Similarly, USS Bunker Hill absorbed catastrophic kamikaze hits at Okinawa and survived. No Essex carrier was ever lost to enemy action. That statistic alone speaks louder than any boast. For the men who served aboard these ships were more than steel. They were lifelines floating cities with populations of nearly 3,000, where young sailors found both terror and pride. The flight deck was a place of thunder and chaos, planes launching every 30 seconds, bombs and torpedoes being rolled out, crash crews waiting for the inevitable accidents. Below decks, mess halls served thousands of meals, machinists toiled in boiling hot engine rooms, and surgeons worked around the clock in steel-walled hospitals. Together they embodied the democratic arsenal of America: farmers' sons, factory workers, immigrants, and college kids, all bound together on a deck that stretched longer than 2 football fields. Strategically, the Essex carriers gave the United States something Japan could never match: momentum. Even after brutal campaigns at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where kamikaze pilots inflicted heavy losses, new Essexes kept arriving. For every damaged or battered ship sent home for repairs, another was ready to take its place. By 1945, the Pacific was crisscrossed with American task forces. The Japanese mainland itself lay under constant bombardment, with Essex-based aircraft pounding Tokyo, Kobe, and Nagoya. Industrial targets, airfields, and naval bases were struck at will. Japan's defensive perimeter had collapsed completely. The legacy of the Essex-class did not end with World War II. When the Korean War erupted in 1950, Essex carriers were modernized and sent once more into combat, this time launching jet aircraft into battle. They continued to serve through the Cold War, standing watch against the Soviet Union, participating in Vietnam, and projecting power around the globe. USS Lexington remained in service until 1991, almost half a century after her commissioning. Today, several Essex carriers survive as museum ships, silent giants that allow new generations to walk their decks and imagine the thunder of warplanes roaring into the sky. In a broader sense, the Essex-class marked the beginning of America's rise to undisputed naval supremacy. After 1945, no nation could challenge the United States at sea. The Royal Navy, once the mistress of the seas, transitioned to a supporting role. The Japanese Navy lay in ruins. The Soviet Union built impressive submarines, but never carriers to rival the Essex fleet. For decades, the sight of an American carrier task force became synonymous with overwhelming power, a floating declaration that America could bring war to any shore. The story of the Essex carriers is ultimately a story about time, about how America turned months and years into weapons sharper than any sword. Japan tried to fight with skill, courage, and surprise, but time betrayed them. Pilots could not be trained fast enough, fuel could not be refined fast enough, ships could not be built fast enough. The Essexes, by contrast, rolled from the slipways like clockwork, each one another nail in the coffin of the Imperial Navy. By the end of the war, it was not just Japanese admirals who were stunned, it was the world. Germany, too, watched as American industry poured forth ships, tanks, planes, and supplies at a scale no one thought possible. But nowhere was that miracle more visible than on the decks of the Essex carriers, where the combined force of millions of workers, thousands of welders, and countless factory lines became flesh and steel. They were called floating airfields, but they were more than that. They were floating symbols of American determination. They carried not only aircraft, but the promise that democracy, when mobilized, could outproduce and outfight tyranny. And as they sailed past islands once thought impregnable, as they struck at cities once thought beyond reach, they proved a truth that still echoes today. America's strength lay not just in courage, but in its ability to build, rebuild, build again until victory was assured.